Have you ever considered the boundless capacity for human depravity? Imagine a king, divinely appointed, who not only renounces his faith, but embraces the most abhorrent practices imaginable. A monarch who immolates his own offspring as offerings, and in a chilling act of injustice, orders the execution of one of the era's most revered prophets. Unthinkable. Perhaps. Yet, the annals of history bear witness to such a figure. King Manasseh of Judah, a ruler whose transgressions shook the very foundations of his kingdom and defied all that was sacred. This is not merely a narrative of rebellion. It is a descent into spiritual abyss, a stark revelation of the potential for human evil, the devastating repercussions of unchecked power, and the haunting question, can redemption ever pierce such profound darkness? Journey with us as we dissect the reign of King Manasseh, probing the depths of his depravity and unearthing the chilling truths that lie buried beneath the ruins of Judah's past. Prepare to confront the unsettling reality of how a man chosen by God could stray so far, and to contemplate the enduring lessons his story imparts about the transformative power of repentance, the immense responsibility of leadership, and the unfathomable depths of human nature. Ready yourself for a harrowing exploration into the heart of darkness, and remember to mark your agreement with 7 times scores in heaven if you feel the weight of this tragic tale. Now let us embark on this unsettling odyssey through the shattered remnants of Judah's history and exhume a truth long concealed. King Manasseh, murderer of the prophet Isaiah, sacrificed his own son. The year was 697 BC. The land of Judah, still reeling from past conflicts and divine admonitions, stood at a precipice, oblivious to the encroaching shadow of one of its bleakest epochs. A mere boy of 12 years ascended the throne. His name was Manasseh, and though his youth might have suggested innocence, his destiny would be stained with rebellion, sorrow, and spiritual betrayal. According to 2 Kings 21:1, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. Outwardly, this era held immense promise. The kingdom he inherited had undergone purification and restoration under the reign of his father, King Hezekiah, a figure celebrated as one of Judah's most righteous leaders. Hezekiah had dismantled the high places, shattered the idols, and reopened the temple, beckoning the nation back to the worship of Yahweh. Could Manasseh possibly sustain such a legacy? The people undoubtedly hoped and prayed that this young king would emulate his father's virtuous path. After all, he had been nurtured in a palace steeped in sacred instruction. The sacred scrolls of the law were read to him. The hymns of David resonated throughout the temple courtyards. Prophets still walked amongst them, and yet, for reasons debated by scholars and theologians, even to this day, the boy's heart began to stray. What transpires when a child raised in righteousness succumbs to the allure of darkness? Initially, the transformation was subtle. Manasseh continued to engage with the priests. He attended lessons imparted by elders who had once advised Hezekiah, but gradually these engagements became less frequent. The boy king matured, and with age came an appetite for power unrestrained by the fear of God. Whispers circulated within the palace. Manasseh was heeding foreign counsel, voices that spoke not of Yahweh, but of Baal and Asherah, of sorcery and divination. Then came the unmistakable signs. Scripture offers no embellishment of the truth. In 2 Kings 21:2, it declares with stark clarity, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. What could impel the child of Judah, a descendant of David, to replicate the very sins that had once brought devastation upon Canaan? Was it arrogance? Was it defiance against the imposing legacy of a righteous father? Or did something more sinister take root within his soul? As the spiritual climate in Jerusalem shifted, the people observed with trepidation. The sacred sites once cleansed by Hezekiah were being rebuilt, not to honor God, but to glorify pagan deities. Altars of blood and fire resurfaced. Groves adorned with carved images began to proliferate on the hills. And Manasseh, no longer the innocent boy, stood at the epicenter of it all. Seemingly pleased, can a nation blessed by God endure when its leader so completely abandons the covenant? The narrative had only just begun, and the choices Manasseh would make next would not only defile the temple, but would also stain the streets of Jerusalem with the blood of the innocent. How could such a downfall occur so swiftly and more profoundly? Could such a downfall occur today in our own lives, when truth is sacrificed for expediency and power supplants reverence? Initially, the harbingers of King Manasseh's descent were akin to faint ripples on a tranquil pond, almost imperceptible, yet subtly foreshadowing an impending tempest. His early decisions did not outwardly manifest as rebellion. Rather, they donned the guise of diplomacy and inclusivity. He began to question the rigid monotheistic stance of his father, King Hezekiah. Was it truly imperative, he openly wondered, to so vehemently reject all other gods? Might a more accommodating approach foster prosperity and harmony for Judah by garnering favor with neighboring nations? This line of reasoning may have appeared prudent to some, but it signaled the inception of a perilous unraveling. Under the pretense of tolerance, Manasseh authorized the construction of small shrines and altars. Altars not dedicated to Yahweh, but to the deities of Sidon, Moab, Ammon, and even the loathsome Baal. These foreign altars began to materialize at city gates and on hilltops once cleared by Hezekiah. They were presented not as religious threats, but as essential instruments of statecraft, a means to cultivate trade, a path to peace, or so the king asserted. The priests who had once rejoiced under Hezekiah's reign were alarmed. The prophets, discerning the spiritual compromise, began to murmur warnings within the temple courtyards, but those voices were swiftly suppressed. Manasseh accused them of clinging to the past, of obstructing Judah's progress, and thus the guardians of truth were marginalized, dismissed as relics of a bygone era. Could a kingdom thrive when its own prophets were regarded as adversaries? As his authority grew more absolute, Manasseh discarded all pretense. What had begun as mere observation of foreign rites soon evolved into wholehearted participation. He no longer merely tolerated the practices of other nations, he embraced them. The king could be seen publicly participating in their ceremonies, prostrating himself before wooden poles carved in the likeness of Asherah, and offering incense to the heavens as chants to Baal reverberated throughout the valleys of Judah. Then came the moment that marked a definitive spiritual betrayal. According to 2 Kings 21:3, he rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. This was not merely a political maneuver. It was an explicit rejection of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Manasseh aligned himself not with his father, the reformer, but with Ahab, the king whose infamy had provoked God's judgment upon the northern kingdom of Israel. Why would a king blessed with divine heritage choose to emulate one of the most wicked rulers in Israel's history? His transformation was as rapid as it was horrifying. The young prince, once nurtured in the law of Moses, became a monarch consumed by the mystical, the forbidden, and the profane. He no longer merely permitted idolatry, he enforced it. Pagan worship became not just acceptable, but endorsed by royal decree. Sacred sites were repurposed for abominable rituals. The temple itself, once cleansed by Hezekiah and made a dwelling for the presence of God, now housed altars to false gods, and the people stood in stunned disbelief as the very heart of Judah's worship was ripped out and replaced with carved images and burning offerings to the heavens. Their heritage was being desecrated before their very eyes. Generations had invoked Yahweh for deliverance from Egypt, from the Philistines, from the Assyrians. Now they were expected to kneel before foreign gods. How did it come to this? The prophets rose in protest. Men like Isaiah, who had beheld visions of God's throne and warned kings with trembling lips, could not remain silent. They spoke with unwavering conviction, imploring Manasseh to remember the covenant, to remember David, to remember who he was. "Return to the Lord," they cried, "lest destruction befall this land, as it did in the north." But Manasseh no longer listened. The voice of the prophet had become to him an annoyance, a reminder of a truth he wished to obliterate. Was he attempting to prove something? Was it defiance toward the memory of his father? Or had the seductive allure of power and paganism simply become too overwhelming to resist? And herein lies the most chilling question of all. When a chosen nation forsakes the voice of its prophets, when its king leads the people astray, and the temple becomes a house of idols, how long can God withhold his judgment? This chapter of Manasseh's story is not yet concluded. What he does next will stain his hands with blood and echo through the generations to come. As the years unfolded and Manasseh's grasp on the kingdom tightened, what had commenced as veiled compromise transformed into a full-scale spiritual assault on everything sacred. The young king, who had once sat under the teachings of Moses, now spearheaded a campaign to uproot the very foundations of Judah's faith. His betrayal was no longer passive. It was calculated, aggressive, and devastating. Manasseh did not merely permit the worship of foreign gods. He orchestrated it. He constructed altars in every city, dedicated temples to idols, and established entire systems of sorcery and spiritual corruption. The distinction between political strategy and demonic devotion had vanished. The once devoted people of Judah, who had for generations worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now found themselves engulfed in confusion and spiritual chaos. Can you envision the agony of a father attempting to instruct his children about Yahweh, while the king himself knelt before idols? How must the elders have felt as they witnessed their sacred traditions mocked and inverted? Some of the people, fearing defiance of the throne, reluctantly followed the king's lead, bowing to gods in whom they did not believe. Others chose silence, whispering prayers in the shadows of their homes, hoping Yahweh still heard them from the depths of national disgrace, but silence would not save them. A storm was brewing, and what was about to unfold would shatter what remained of Judah's moral structure. The scriptures offer no sugarcoating. The sacred text of 2 Kings 21:6 unveils a chilling truth. He burned his own son as an offering, practiced divination, and was a medium and spiritist. He did many evil things in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. What began as rebellion had now become pure horror. Manasseh crossed a line so vile that even the most depraved kings of Israel had not dared to tread so far. He did not merely worship false gods. He offered them the blood of his own children. The flames that consumed his son were not accidents of war nor punishments of law, but the deliberate fire of Molech worship, an ancient Canaanite ritual that demanded innocent lives. How does a father become so desensitized that he willingly consigns his own child to the flames? And that was merely the beginning. This was not a singular moment of madness. It became a pattern. In 2 Chronicles 33:6, the text reveals a deeper horror. He burned his children as sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, practiced sorcery, divination, and magic, and consulted mediums and spiritists. Children, plural. Manasseh's hands were not stained with one act of bloodshed, but many. The valley of Ben Hinnom, once a place of shadow and waste, became a stage for unthinkable evil. It would eventually bear the name Gehenna, a word Jesus would later use to describe hell itself. Was there no limit to how far a king could fall? The sacrifice of children in Judah's own soil transformed the kingdom into a realm of dread. Families were shattered. Mothers wept as they witnessed their households torn apart. The streets echoed with silent cries, and through it all, Manasseh stood unmoved, convinced he was doing what pleased the gods he had embraced. But the God of Israel had not forgotten, nor had his prophets. Among those born into this collapsing kingdom was a boy named Jeremiah, the prophet who would later weep over Jerusalem's destruction, had his first glimpses of the world, shaped under Manasseh's reign, and his words were searing. In Jeremiah 32:35, the prophet speaks on behalf of the Lord, saying, "They built the altars of Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing, and so make Judah sin." Did you grasp the significance of that statement? The Lord himself declared that this sin was so aberrant, so far beyond the boundaries of covenant life, that it had not even occurred to his divine mind. That is the magnitude of Manasseh's depravity. He committed what was, in the eyes of heaven, unthinkable. And yet, even with the blood of innocents soaking the soil, the people did not revolt. The spiritual numbness had become pervasive. What happens when evil becomes so normalized that no one sheds tears anymore? The destruction of Judah's spiritual heritage was nearly complete, but Manasseh was not yet finished. The persecution of the righteous had only just begun. The corruption introduced during Manasseh's reign did not merely taint the temple or distort the rituals of worship. It cut deep into the very core of Jewish society, inflicting wounds that would not easily heal. What began as spiritual compromise escalated into a widespread collapse of moral order. The practices he unleashed, especially the horrific sacrifice of children, left scars not only on the soul of the nation, but also on its families, its institutions, and its standing in the world. Imagine a father forced to choose between obedience to God and obedience to the king. Picture a mother weeping as her household is torn apart by decrees she cannot resist. These were not distant or symbolic tragedies. They were real. Households were shattered, Entire communities were divided. Those who remained faithful to the God of their ancestors were driven underground, concealing their prayers, protecting their children, and whispering the scriptures in fear of discovery. Those who embraced the king's cultic agenda gained favor, but at what cost to their conscience? What happens to a nation when evil becomes law and righteousness becomes rebellion? The cost extended beyond the spiritual. It permeated society. The ripple effect reached into Judah's economy. Once esteemed as a beacon of justice and divine wisdom, a reputation solidified during the golden age of Solomon and revived under Hezekiah, Judah began to lose favor among its neighbors. Trade routes that had once flowed through its borders slowed. Merchants grew wary. Foreign emissaries, once impressed by the moral strength and unity of the kingdom, now whispered of blood rights and madness within its gates. Could any nation prosper when its king was renowned more for sorcery than for stewardship? Within Judah, the suffering was most keenly felt by those least able to defend themselves. The poor, those who lacked political influence or familial protections, were particularly vulnerable to the demands of pagan priests and the pressures of a corrupt government. When child sacrifices became state-sanctioned, it was the lower-class families who were most often targeted. In silence and sorrow, they bore the heaviest burden of a reign gone mad. Social divisions deepened. Trust between tribes, towns, and even neighbors began to erode. A pervasive dread settled across the land, where once people gathered joyfully to worship Yahweh and celebrate holy festivals. Now they walked with eyes downcast, unsure whom to trust. Some succumbed, joining the rituals out of fear. Others resisted in silence, and still others vanished altogether, taken as offerings or punished for defiance. The rot seeped into the educational heart of the kingdom. Schools that had once trained children in the law of Moses were either closed or transformed. The sacred Torah was replaced by scrolls of dark knowledge. The songs of David gave way to incantations. The schools of the prophets, those holy places that had produced voices like Elijah, Elisha, and Isaiah, were shuttered or driven into the wilderness. In their place arose new centers of influence where sorcery was studied, and spirits were summoned under the guise of royal approval. How could the next generation rise in truth when lies were taught as doctrine? Politically, the cost was equally steep. Even among pagan nations, Manasseh's excesses were deemed extreme. While many neighboring kingdoms engaged in idolatry, few went so far as to publicly embrace child sacrifice or elevate mediums to the king's court. The king of Judah was no longer regarded as a wise ruler, but as a dangerous and unpredictable figure. Treaties were dissolved, alliances frayed. Judah became isolated, both spiritually and diplomatically, standing alone in a world that now viewed it with a mixture of suspicion and horror. And perhaps most devastating of all was the damage this reign of terror inflicted upon the throne of David. The royal line, once perceived as a sacred extension of God's covenant, now appeared tainted. People began to question whether the promise made to David that his throne would endure forever had been broken. Was God still with Judah, or had he turned his face away? In the silent spaces of temple ruins, in the alleys where prophets once walked, and in the shattered homes of grieving parents, that question resonated louder than any trumpet of war. Would the God of Israel still honor his promise after such betrayal? And yet, even as darkness spread across the kingdom like a thick, suffocating fog, a fragile light persisted, hidden in homes, caves, and corners of the temple ruins. There lived a faithful remnant, men, women, and children who refused to forsake their God. Though they were small in number and crushed under the weight of fear, their devotion burned brightly. They preserved the sacred scrolls, whispered the Psalms of David in hushed tones, and passed on the teachings of the Torah from parent to child, heart to heart. Their faith, though threatened with extinction, became a silent rebellion against a kingdom that had lost its soul. What compels a person to remain faithful when faith has become a death sentence? They clung to the hope that one day Yahweh would restore his people, that the covenant made with Abraham and reaffirmed through David would not be erased by the sins of one wicked king. Inspired by the voices of prophets who refused to be silenced, they endured. Though they possessed no armies, no altars, and no freedom to worship openly, they became keepers of divine memory in a land intoxicated by idolatry. But heaven was not oblivious to the blood that cried out from the ground. As Manasseh's reign dragged on, the cries of the innocent, of the sacrificed, the silenced, the slain, ascended like incense before the throne of God. The patience of the Almighty, though boundless, is not without its limits. What transpires when the cup of iniquity overflows? What judgment awaits a nation led not only into sin, but into the very abominations God once commanded Israel to eradicate? The reign of Manasseh would bequeath a legacy so dark that it would echo through generations. The human sacrifices committed during his rule were not isolated instances of horror. They were defining markers in the moral collapse of Judah. Even long after his death, the memory of these atrocities would cling to the soul of the nation like a scar that refused to heal. The economic collapse, the spiritual disintegration, the international isolation, all were rooted in his choices. So, as we've journeyed through the dark and unsettling reign of King Manasseh, we've seen the depths to which unchecked power and a rejection of faith can lead. It's a story that forces us to confront the potential for human depravity, the devastating consequences of turning away from truth, and the enduring question of whether redemption is possible even after the most profound fall. Ultimately, Manasseh's story serves as a powerful reminder of the immense responsibility of leadership, the importance of staying true to our values, and the transformative power of repentance, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What struck you most about Manasseh's story? Do you have any questions or insights you'd like to share? Please leave a comment down below. I'm really interested in hearing your perspectives and continuing this important conversation. And if you found this exploration of King Manasseh's reign thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future dives into history's most compelling and complex figures. We have lots more fascinating stories to uncover together. Thanks for watching.